Welcome to the Leverington Church message series, Beyond Order and Chaos, a biblical encounter with Jordan Peterson's latest book. For the full series and additional resources, go to www.leverington.org.
In this moment, I am very tempted to take the fact that I'm in this warm room with all of you for granted. When just 20 feet this way, it is cold and miserable, and I could be living there. In this moment, I'm tempted to take for granted what you guys just did for us. And Ajibolo, that was the best bass playing on that song I've ever heard. I just got to tell you, man, that was awesome. But I'm very tempted to just take everything I just experienced there for granted. The talent, the ability, the hours these guys put in, the profound access that was provided there. I can take it all for granted. This is why in his book, Beyond Order, Jordan Peterson gives us this first rule for life. He says, do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. We so often do. We are tempted to despise and take for granted all the infrastructure, the organizations that hold things together, that make our lives so much better than they could be. We have food on the shelves and school for our kids, and we can gather here without fear of persecution this morning. And we tend to despise it and take it as nothing. And we also tend to reject as strange or weird creative people who question the norms, who experiment, who bring us new things. And we tend to be so dismissive of that. Oh, they're just weird. You guys, we can be so arrogant, so ungrateful, we don't even notice the blessings that are all around us. Why do we do that? Well, it turns out these attitudes are just the tip of an iceberg of a deeper problem. One of the saddest but most honest descriptions of the human condition that I've ever read is found in the book of Romans, chapter 1, starting in verse 21. Paul is speaking to the peoples of the world and to the history of the peoples of the world, and he says this: they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man or other created things. What he is implying is a process over time, that there was a time when people could actually see reality for what it is, but then over time became blind to it. That people were so enamored with their own ideas that they became blind, cut off from God, cut off from the transcendent. They created a closed system of their own making, a model of reality rather than reality itself, a model of reality, and they ended up loving and worshiping the model, an intellectual idol made with their own hands rather than reality and the one who is reality. They were more interested in the story they were telling than in the story that God was telling. We don't want to be like them. But you might say, oh, Langdon, this isn't written to us. I mean, after all, we're Christians. We know the truth. So we don't need to worry about this stuff. Professing themselves wise, they became fools. No, this is written to us just as much as to anybody else. In fact, I think in this cultural moment that you are living in right now, and that I'm living in right now, we tend to be seduced by one of two false stories currently circulating in this world. These stories are everywhere around us. They are in the air we breathe, just like COVID. And just like COVID, though, they are invisible to us. We aren't even aware that we are breathing them in and breathing them out. And these two stories contribute to the division and polarization we're experiencing. Because if your neighbor's living in one story and you're living in another story, then you're going to be talking right past each other. And what this person's concerned about isn't even what this person is concerned about. Now, these two stories I'm talking about are not politics. I'm not talking about progressives and conservatives. No, this is much deeper than that. These two stories are very different explanations of reality, and neither of them are Christian, but Christians are tempted to be seduced by one or the other. Both of them are false gospels. And my goal today is to expose them, to help you understand what they got right, what they got wrong, but especially to make them visible to you the way a black light, reveals stuff on your clothes that you didn't even know was there. The Word of God can do that when it comes to these philosophies that are in the air that we don't even know we are breathing in. The names of these two false stories are modernism and postmodernism. Oh man, why do we need to dive into all this theoretical, philosophical stuff? Because we are all much more affected by them than we even realize. We don't even know it's happening as it's happening. Now, I do love nice, short, simple sermons with 3 practical takeaway points that you can apply to your life. This is not that sermon. This is a sermon about wading into deep waters, wrestling with complex issues, because sound bites and slogans can't get us where we need to go. In fact, the point of this sermon is to help you realize when the explanations people are giving you about reality are too simple, too one-sided, and that is exactly what both modernism and postmodernism do. They tell us a story that's too simple. The story that both modernism and postmodernism tell us starts out with this great hope and optimism for the future, but both of them end in a cul-de-sac of meaninglessness and despair. And so what I want to do is explore these two things so that we can understand how Orthodox Christianity saves us from the errors of both. So in order to understand these two movements, we have to be willing to dig into the history of thought. So hang in there with me as we jump into the deep end. Here we go. As many of you know, sometime around the early 1700s came the Enlightenment. And we call this movement the Enlightenment because it felt like a light went on. We suddenly realized that reason and science could be applied to the world to solve problems. And we kept finding it worked and it worked. And we solved this problem and we solved this problem, and life got better and better. And so the people back then were very optimistic about the future. Think about the 1960s with the landing on the moon. Some of us here, I'm old enough to remember that night. I was looking at a tiny little black and white TV at my aunt's house, and I can actually remember my dad saying, "This is important. History is being made." We landed a man on the moon. Like, what couldn't we do? How great is science? How great is capitalism? How great is the Western culture? Look what we have been able to do. Who knows what we'll be able to do in the future? So think about, those of you who are old, Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry. He was so enamored by science that he believed that in the future there would be no disease and no poverty and no need for money. Who knows what we'll be able to do? And then arose a group of critics called the postmodernists. They arose, and this is what they said. They looked at the modernists and they said, "You told us we were going to get utopia. But what did we really get? Life has been reduced, human flourishing has been reduced to wheels and gears and spreadsheets and chains. Life has been reduced to equations and stuff. Human beings have been reduced to machines. They're cogs in a wheel, or they're just consumers. They're nothing but a unit of production or a unit of consumption. You've given us an industrial wasteland. You've made culture superficial, without meaning or hope. You've turned us into lonely individuals who have become alienated from each other and alienated from the natural world. And what was your error? You had a faulty worldview, and it was based on arrogance and upon ignorance. You thought you could be this neutral third-party observer, that you're outside the experiment, and you in all your wisdom and omniscience can look down and tell what is actually happening. No, you're down in the petri dish. You're in the middle of the experiment. And because you're down in the middle of the experiment, you don't have this grand view of everything. And you're seeing reality through all these lenses of your own culture and your own experiences and your own privilege. And that means you don't see right. In fact, there are things here that you don't even notice, you don't even see, because of the biases, of the assumptions of this model that you've made. Now, as far as that goes, I think postmodern critics are right on. They go further. And because of this, because of your ignorance and your blindness, you have done terrible crimes against other cultures, and you've done terrible crimes against the environment. And there is no grand narrative, no grand story that explains everything. Human knowledge is fractured and piecemeal. And again, I think this is a helpful critique, because the hubris and arrogance of modernism blinded it to its own downside. And I think that postmodernism is like a counselor to the king. And as long as it's giving advice to the king needs to hear it and go, oh, that's right. But when that counselor becomes the king, when postmodernity overruled modernity, it became even a worse tyrant than modernism. You see, modernity had become arrogant and rigid and so foolish. And then postmodernism grew up and became arrogant and rigid and so foolish. So let me throw these two up side by side so you can get a handle. I know this is crazy and deep, and we're going to go fast, but all this will be available on the website as well. So what would a hardcore modernist say as opposed to what a hardcore postmodernist would say? A modernist would say, I see reality objectively, and it can be fully described by science and reason alone. Right? So if you can't prove it by science, it doesn't exist. A postmodernist would say, there is no universal truth, only the meaningful stories we tell ourselves. A modernist would say, everything fits into one unifying grand story. And here in the West, Western modernism would say that is progress, that story is progress based on capitalism plus science. Capitalism plus science. A postmodernist would say human knowledge is fractured and piecemeal. There is no grand unifying story. A modernist would say systems work. They all need to be protected and improved. A postmodernist says systems exploit and dehumanize. They are all power games. They all need to be deconstructed. The extreme modernist focuses on the freedom of the individual. The extreme postmodernist focuses on the responsibility that one has to the collective. The modernist says life is about gaining more knowledge or more wealth. In other words, life is about progress. The postmodernist says life is about justice and honest art and disrupting what has come before. The extreme modernist says this. Well, this is what they do. They reduce society to one monolithic cultural norm, and they divide people into two groups, achievers and non-achievers. Extreme postmodernists reduce society to issues of power between tribes. So you're either a perpetrator or you're a victim. So what happens is modernists tend to focus on the benefits of existing structures and hierarchies, while postmodernists tend to focus on the corruption and oppression that institutions and hierarchies produce. They both reduce a very complicated situation into one naive extreme or the other. They only see half the picture. So, how much and what do you see? When you look at the institutions of our culture, when you look at the government and businesses and corporations and unions and universities and the church, what do you see? Do you see healthy, functioning systems, or do you see corrupt hierarchies based on selfish power? I don't like the word hierarchy. Most people in this cultural moment don't like that word hierarchy. Is hierarchy itself the problem? Jordan Peterson argues 2 points, and you need both points to get what he's saying. Here's his first point. A hierarchy based on excellence and achievement, which is a meritocracy. So meritocracy is the people at the top merit it because they worked really hard or they have really good gifts and really good skills, so they should be on top. A hierarchy based on excellence and achievement is the fairest and the most motivating social structure possible, and it results in increased standard of living for the whole society at large over time. Well, that sounds pretty good. However, and here's his second point, the problem is all hierarchies drift towards unfairness and corruption. Why? We just heard it back in Romans. Thinking themselves wise, in their arrogance, they became foolish. Christians say because the problem with hierarchies is they're full of people, and people are sinful. People are arrogant, people are selfish, and so hierarchies are always drifting. It's like entropy. They're always drifting toward power and corruption. So here's the question. Do you see our culture as a place where people can become anything they want to become if they work hard enough, and so it's only right that the brightest and smartest and most talented are on the top of the pyramid? Or if someone asked you what life was really like, for example, let's say they asked you, could you draw an organizational chart of the company that you work with? Would you draw something like this? Does that look a little too painfully familiar to you? Now, this to me is either really funny or heartbreaking, right? It's very sad. It's very funny to me. It's very cynical. It's too simple. Cynicism is always too simple. It always tells too simple of a story because real life, of course, is far more complicated than that. For one thing, in each of those sections, people are moving. There are people who started at the bottom and worked their way all the way to the top. And so people who love this go, especially capitalists who are on the top, go, see, it's great, it works, it's fair. Yeah, but not everyone gets that. And there's all kinds of corruption and reasons that people who deserve to get moved ahead don't. And so it's complicated. And so the idea that we live in this perfectly fair meritocracy is far too simple. Some of the people who are on top in our different institutions are there because of incredible hard work and incredible talent and abilities. But there are other people who are on the top because they're incredibly manipulative and selfish, and they abuse their power to get what they want and to keep other people out. So it's a big mixed bag. And things never stay the same. It's always moving. And so keeping institutions like our church, like the government, like any organization of people, it requires constant attendance, constant reformation, because it's always drifting into an unfair, corrupt hierarchy of power. Now, the modernist wants to pretend that everything is great, and the postmodernist wants to pretend that everything is terrible. The modernist wants to keep things just the way they are, and they're oblivious to all the bad side effects of this approach. And the postmodernist wants to tear it all down, oblivious of how hard it was to build these things to begin with, how much everyone would truly suffer if all our institutions collapsed. The gains and blessings and comforts and medicines and clean water and safe food and warm houses we have did not arise easily, and they're not simple things. So you can't just throw a monkey wrench into a nuclear reactor unless you really know what you're doing. So while modernism and postmodernism both have really helpful insights, neither is sufficient to fully explain the world around us. Listen, neither of them in itself is a sufficient platform to provide long-term human flourishing. Now, if this was the 1950s, I think most of us would probably be seduced by the modernist view. But here in the 2020s, I think most of us are being seduced by the postmodernist view. All right, but what's so wrong with that? Here's what's so wrong. We are even more critical of existing institutions than we should be, thereby making them even more corrupt. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing. We need enough criticism and skepticism about our institutions to keep authority in account and to reform those systems as they corrupt. But if you're too critical and too skeptical, you don't reform it, you destroy it. It disintegrates. We have unknowingly, uncritically accepted what postmodernism told us, assumptions that are not true. We have given up believing we can ever know truth or find it. We laugh and scoff at anyone who is sure about anything. We say they are either ignorant or fools. But what if it's us? We see everything, and see, this is what this stance does. It makes us all begin to see everything in terms of power. And so we don't trust any leaders or any experts. And we think the only reason they're saying the things they're saying or doing the things they're doing is because they want power. We see very real corruption, right? Like we see corruption in our institutions, and it's real and it's a problem. But then that makes us cynical and jaded. And then we say, hey, I'm going to play the game as well. I'm not going to be a sucker. I don't want to be the loser at the bottom of the pyramid. So now we become skeptical of everyone else's motives. We use words not to tell the truth, but to get what we want. We lie without a second thought. And then we take part in the institutions, and we are corrupt. And so we make those institutions even more corrupt. The darkness of the thoughts in our minds contributes to the darkness in reality of the world. And then the darkness in the reality of the world contributes to the darkness in our minds. And it's this big, terrible feedback loop. Is there any hope? Well, over 2,500 years ago, a man named Jeremiah stood up in the middle of time, in the middle of culture. He opened his mouth, and this is what he said in Jeremiah 6, starting in verse 16. This is what the Lord says. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it. And then you will find rest for your souls. But you said, we will not. We will not walk in it. I appointed a watchman over you and said, listen to the sound of the trumpet. But you said, we will not. We will not listen. So what does Jeremiah believe? He believed that God exists. He believes God exists and that he has given us a way to live. And it's an ancient path built into reality itself that you can walk in now in the present tense. It works in every culture, in every generation. It is a new experience every time it is walked. And even though the path is ancient, when is the trumpet going off? In the present tense, here and now. It's not ancient, it's here, it's now, it's in the middle of our lives. But we will what? We will not walk in it. We will not listen. What word do you hear there? Will. Will. Our will. We will not. Thinking ourselves wise, we reject it. We think this path can't be real, because it does not appear in the maps we made for ourselves. And here's what's really heartbreaking. If submitting to God is exactly what we need most, who would it be hardest for to do that? People who think everything is about power. You might, oh yeah, but I was with you for a while. This was kind of deep and interesting, but now you've gone into organized religion. Organized religion, that's just another corrupt institution. And so when we see that, we say, and here's how you know if you're really postmodern. You say, I'm not religious. I'm spiritual. And we think that when we say that, we're being so original and so enlightened. But what if it is actually a sign of our own blindness and prejudice, a sign of how much we have accepted a postmodern set of assumptions without even knowing it? What if what we're really doing is parroting the spirit of the present moment? That we are parroting the dominant spirit of our age. Yeah, but really, is that where the answer is found in organized religion? No, I'm spiritual. Well, if you're spiritual, if you're truly spiritual, and by that you don't mean you just enjoy your hobbies of looking out at the stars and drinking Tai Chi and listening to funky music. I do all of those things. If it's more than that, if what you really mean is I believe there is a spiritual realm, well then wouldn't it be the person who is the most spiritual person who ever walked the earth that could most explain to us what is true spirituality and also what is the role of organized religion? How did Jesus understand hierarchies and institutions? Were they terrible and unnecessary or vital and perfect? Well, let's see what Jesus actually said. In Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 17, he says this: "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until it is all accomplished." Whoa, that sounds pretty institutional to me. Like the old is good. These are unchanging principles and values for all times and all places and all cultures. Apparently, he's not coming to deconstruct the written text, but to build something new upon it because it is a solid foundation. Okay, does this mean that Jesus is saying existing power structures are just fine the way they are, and things should never change, and you should never question religious authorities, including me? That organized religion is just great the way it is? Well, skip down through Matthew to chapter 23, and in chapter 23, Jesus says, starting in verse 11, "But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted." What's he describing there? A meritocracy. This is what a healthy hierarchy looks like. The greatest among you, the ones at the very top, shall be the servant of all, because they realize that we're all created equal in the image of God. And the people below me are just as important as I am. In fact, I should be serving everyone in my organization. So the idea of hierarchy isn't bad. He's assuming there will be a hierarchy, but there's good hierarchies and bad hierarchies. Okay, but now listen to what he says to the current occupants of the highest positions in the religious hierarchy at that time. Dropping down to verse 13, he says, "But woe to you. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from the people. For you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. In other words, you have corrupted the hierarchy. You have used your position of responsibility for personal gain. And I'm only reading a small part of what he goes on and on and on against these guys. But then how does he conclude in verse 37? He goes, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Jerusalem who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her." In other words, those who critique the established order. "How often I've wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were" what? "Unwilling. I will not. Therefore, behold, your house is being left to you desolate." He is critiquing a corrupt hierarchy, not the idea of hierarchy itself. So does he just destroy his opponents the way we do on social media? No. Who's Jerusalem? Jerusalem is those guys. He's talking about them. You guys, the scribes, the Pharisees, how much I wanted to gather you in and take you in and show you this ancient path, but you would have none of it. You see, we see human hierarchy and we see how messed up it is, and that sours us on the real thing, the hierarchy of God. We are to bend our knee before the maker of heaven and earth, but we can't even stand the idea that any hierarchy could be legitimate. But you see, the problem is he won't fit in the model, the map I've made of reality. God can't fit in my schema. He can't fit into a modernist reality. He can't fit into a postmodern reality. And so what do? I have to choose between the model I'm living in, which is not reality, it's a model of reality, or reality. But then I'd have to bend my knee to my maker. I reject my master. I hold on to my model. And then I'm left desolate, without meaning, and without hope. Okay, Langdon, but organized religion, I still don't find that very attractive. It's old, it's ancient, it's primitive, it's so restraining and limiting. It has walls that mark the inside from the outside. And it just sits there. It doesn't really do much. It doesn't seem like there's much about the future in it. Well, I know something else that is ancient and primitive and restraining and limiting, and it has walls that mark the outside from the inside, and it just sits there. It's called a flower pot. It's ancient and it's old, and it just sits there. In fact, the one you're looking at is over 2,000 years old. It's a Roman flower pot from 2,000 years ago that life is living in now. The pot is ancient. The life is present. It holds it and sustains it. It's rigid. It restrains and hems in, but that is exactly what is needed. In a dry, desolate world, you have to hold in the moisture and hold in this environment so that this plant can actually grow. The walls and restraint help it grow. Think of the church as an old flower pot. It not only holds the dirt, the environment together, it holds all of us together. Like all these flowers in this pot. I have friends here, looking at all your faces. I have friends here that I would never have known if I hadn't been part of this community. I have friends here from all circles and walks of life. If I had not been part of this church, I would have had this very small little set of friends, and all people kind of like me in the same realm as me. The church busts that open and allows us to experience real community. So, you want something practical? I'm going to get practical with you. What happens when you're alone with your thoughts? Are any of you ever tortured by your thoughts? Am I the only one? When it's only you that you're talking to, they're not a good person for conversation. They're kind of wacky. They make you wacky, and they keep saying the same things over and over again. But what happens when we hang out with other people? When we have interaction with other people? It demotes that inner voice, and I hear the voices of all of you, and I hear your opinions, and I get a reality check. It's kind of like, wait, am I crazy? Am I crazy? Am I crazy? Oh, and it helps me center myself. What if we actually need community in order to maintain our sanity? Jordan Peterson writes this. This is for all the counselors out there. Freud and Jung placed too little focus on the role of the community in the maintenance of personal mental health. Without the intermediation of the social world, it would be impossible for us to organize our minds, and we would simply be overwhelmed by the world. People remain mentally healthy not merely because of the integrity of their own minds, but because they are constantly being reminded how to think and act and speak by those around them. Sometimes they'll be talking with someone and they'll be like, that's just crazy talk. I'm like, oh, you're right. We need each other. And where are we going to be exposed to this wide range of people in this deep way? In places like the church, like this. So, look again at this earthen flower pot of the church. It's put in a particular place. It raises the plants out of the shadows, up into the light, to the exposure of this external power source that they need to be connected with in order to live, even though that power source seems infinitely far away. It hits right here, right now. And this particular one, if any of you have ever been to Santorini, I think I've actually seen that pot. It's very intimate and close. I can touch the pot, but it has a view of the farther shore. It's located in a place that's right here where I am, but there's a vista to the world beyond. It is where heaven and earth meet. Our small, fragmented lives exposed to eternity. What if the new life you need is found in an old, beat-up flower pot called the church? It has feet of clay, but gives us access to the heavens. We have this hope in jars of clay. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. Jesus said that in this world of human ideologies and philosophies and hierarchies and power plays, keep your eyes on me. Keep your eyes on the story I'm telling, because it's the story you're living in. You see, the problem with the Western meta-narrative is not that we had a meta-narrative. It was that our meta-narrative was too small and too enclosed. Christianity, hear this, Christianity is a story with an open window. Christianity is a story with a skylight open to heaven beyond. It has solid walls, like a flower pot, that can be trusted, but it is open to the heavens. Jesus says to us, keep your eyes on me. Don't settle for philosophies of human making that keep you in a box of futile speculations where hearts become dark. Turn to the one who opened the box and came down into it, who blew the top off the box so we could see the stars of heaven moving overhead. God is working now. God is changing lives now. God is doing a new thing within the ancient walls of the church. Will you join him there? Amen.
Thanks for joining us today as we strive to think carefully about our faith. You can help keep this ministry on the air by making a donation at leverington.org. For now, may the Lord bless you and keep you. We'll see you next time.